continue with part 2 of this. Okay, again, continue with part 2.
It was worth a shot. Anakin took his new blaster and the small emblem and escaped back home. Without knowledge of Jalen's plan, he just kind of hid everything under his bed and went about his normal activity. Daily activities, if you will. The following day, Jalen would approach Anakin again as he was going home from work.
Hey, Skywalker. How was your day, buddy?
I hate Watto. I just hate him.
What did he do?
He found out I was using parts that no one bought for my protocol droid. Luckily, he didn't take the droid, but he told me if he ever found out I was doing that again, he would sell me to the Zagarians.
Well, we can't be having that, can we?
What do you mean?
With protection from Dragon's breath, he could handle your little problem. It just means that you would have to work for us long term.
Doing...
Hang on.
What?
Well, you'd be a mechanic if you wanted. I'd even take you under my wing. Why not?
I told you I don't like death. I hate him, but that's not really up my alley.
Okay. How about this? Working for the crew will get you paid. You can buy you and your mom's freedom.
I'd honestly rather do that.
Welcome to the crew, kid.
Anakin just looked at Jalen with a blank stare, but the crew member knew how to handle the situation. He told Skywalker that if he wanted to take a look at the shop, he could. Anakin nodded his head with a little convincing. As Skywalker came closer, Jalen put his arm around his shoulder and told the boy that there was surely going to be parts he could use to build the droid if he wanted. That uplifted Anakin's spirits, but not anything like what he saw when he entered the shop. It was attached to the cantina that Dragon's Breath called home. Anakin looked at all the vehicles. Most of them were speeders, but behind it, it was a starship shop. They were mostly quick little ships, mostly vessels that could break past blockades or do smuggling operations. It was a way for the crew to make credits on the side. The operation wasn't large, just competing for the manufacturer control they believed they could attain. Jalen told Anakin to go check it out. Skywalker lit up with excitement as he ran into the room and looked at all the pieces and parts. Some of the other mechanics knew that Jalen was pushing for Skywalker to become a part of the crew, so they were welcoming upon his arrival. It was another good way to help recruit new kids. It wasn't like they would just treat him any differently when he was a member, it was just more or less them upping their standards to get him to join them rather than the other groups and crews around the city. After a couple hours, Jalen tossed Anakin his spare credits and told him that it was his first day's worth of earning. It wasn't really much of anything, but it was the first credits Anakin ever earned. He was so excited at the idea of making money for himself, so he thanked Jalen and then told him he'd be back tomorrow. Anakin did keep coming back. His main goal was to save up money to buy both his mom and his freedom. Shmi was left in the dark of all of this for the most part, simply because he knew that she wouldn't approve of him joining a crew, though even Anakin believed that she would have accepted it because of the new energy he had every day. Shmi only wanted Anakin to be happy, and while she would have been upset about the news as she found out, she was just happy to see Anakin come home with joy on his face. She did get curious where all the credits were coming from, and Anakin told her that he found a mechanic shop that believed in him. It was technically not a lie, but he also just left out parts that included him doing target practice for fun and becoming friends with one of the crew bosses of Mos Espa. When Anakin reached the age of 15, he was one of the better members of the crew. He was still technically a slave, but his time with Dragon's Breath over the past 5 years really opened him up to a world he'd yet to encounter. As a kid in Mos Espa, of course he saw it, but he never really lived it. Being a slave gave him so much protection, and because he was still a slave, he had that protection, but Anakin was getting antsy. Watto didn't know Anakin was in the crew, but he could assume based on the fact that Anakin was always hanging out with members of the crew. Though one thing that set him apart was the fact that he never wore crew colors, or their patches, so it was hard to call him a member. Anakin did this because he was still a slave, and technically he couldn't become a full-time member until he was a free person. The only reason Anakin wasn't free by this point is because Watto refused to accept pay from Anakin. Essentially, once Anakin started making money from the crew, he asked Watto how much he needed to buy his own freedom. He was given an outrageous price, but he worked for it. Dragon's Breath appreciated his work, because without it, they would have had some struggles when it came to crew-related conflicts. His work on their modes of transportation allowed them to secure pieces of the territory without much struggle. Anakin worked overtime to make the money only for Watto to raise the prices on him. This happened 3 times in the past 5 years, and while that might not seem like a lot, Anakin saved up his money for at most 2.5 years, only for Watto to tell him that the prices increased due to Anakin being older. It wasn't really that true, but it irked Anakin a lot. He was getting really good with fighting. He knew a couple moves that would be considered martial arts, and he was poetic with a blaster. This only made him more antsy to kill Watto, but he held off. Until one day, he snapped. It was a normal day for Anakin. He was doing manual labor for Watto inside the shop, just as he had for years. A man came into his shop and his name was Clique Lars. He was going to buy Shmi, but Watto, with the assumption that Lars wouldn't pay the price, told him that if he wanted the mother, then he'd have to buy the son. This was far too expensive for Klieg, and so he left the shop. Watto refused to give up Anakin or his mother unless he got a good price, and currently, the Hutts weren't budging either. They saw the potential in him, but not worthy of being bought at the moment. This was mostly due to the mother, because Watto refused to sell them separately. The Hutts, more or less, saw Watto as too greedy for his own good. Despite Anakin not wearing crew colors for the duration of the past couple years, he finally donned them. He was going to kill Watto himself. He saved up money for 5 years and he could secure his mother a nice place to live, which would be even better in his own mind. He would get the pleasure of killing Watto and freeing his mother, and himself from slavery all in one go. Not to mention providing for her so she could be kept safe. Without thinking, Anakin went to Jalem and told him he was ready. By this point, everyone knew what he meant. They were going to help initiate Skywalker into the crew fully. He was already a member by their own views, but as is tradition, all members must carve the crest of Dragon's Breath into their first victims' throats. It was as vile and disgusting as it sounded, but to Anakin, nothing sounded better. It was early evening and Watto let Anakin get off early that night. It was the last mistake he would ever make. He turned around to see Anakin enter his shop, and within moments, he was on the ground with his wings flapping violently, trying to escape, before a blood-curdling cry could be heard echoing out from the shop. The crest was planted in his neck, and the crew left to celebrate Anakin finally joining the crew. They spent all night at the cantina partying and enjoying their time. Dragon's Breath was at its peak, and while Anakin was one of the youngest members of the crew, Jalem had a reward for him. He brought out a crest patch of a lieutenant's position. It was the highest position in the crew that wasn't crew leader. Jalem gave it to him because Anakin was always in the shop. He was a great shot, he was humble, and he always looked after his friends in the crew. Anakin's brotherhood with the brothers and sisters of Dragon's Breath was everything to him. With Watto dead, and an official marking made by the crew, Jabba would not interact with the situation, so Anakin was safe. There was a reason for this. Jabba believed that if a crew marked a body, then that meant the individual was bad for the greater good of the community of Mos Espa, or whatever city it was. It allowed the crews to feel like they had power and influence, when in reality it would only stoke the flames of war, and this did. Anakin, after a long night out with his family, returned home. He was going to tell his mother in the morning about their freedom, and that wherever she wanted to live in the city, they could move there. He had an idea, but he wanted to wait till morning to tell her. She'd been looking for a home in the upper parts of the city. It was mostly peaceful up there, and it was pretty much upper class of the poor. It was a place where people felt like they were special, when in reality, they're just like everyone else. They just were situated on top of the little plateau. Anakin was so excited though. Of course, it would mean longer trips for him, but anything to make his mother happy. He went to sleep that night, and in the morning he woke up, grabbing his muffin portions and setting it up as he would any other day. 3PO had some polished padding around him. It wasn't beautiful, but it was nicer than most protocol droids on the planet. Anakin ate his muffin and looked for his mother. She walked out of her room and looked at him and asked why he was so excited. He told her that he had terrific news for her. Watto died and now they were free. She smiled and kinda nodded her head, agreeing that it was good news. Shmi didn't really process any of it, so she walked to the kitchen before turning back with her eyes wider than the twin suns. Anakin was giddy with excitement as they hugged each other. So many years of torment finally over. They were free people. They laughed and hugged for several minutes as Anakin told her that all the money he saved up could be used to buy her a home wherever she wanted. She just needed to name the place and he would get it for her. Shmi smiled and sat down. She told him that there was no need for that. This was her home right here. She didn't need to go out looking for anything else. She was happy right where she was. But Anakin, he could buy a starship. He could go out and see the galaxy. Anakin smiled at the idea, but then remembered the whole crew thing. One couldn't just leave the crew. They were bound to it for life. So Anakin just nodded his head, thinking that he could do some spice running or smuggler-type jobs, and tell her that he was actually out seeing the galaxy. Technically telling the truth, but not the whole truth. Anakin gave her a handful of credits and told her to go out and enjoy herself for the day, and every day that followed. She smiled and thanked him kindly. She grabbed something to drink while Anakin went back to his room to work on 3PO for some more. There was something wrong with his eye that needed fixing. Once it was done, he would go out to the crew and get some more clothing. It didn't take more than a minute or two to get the eye to work. He grabbed his K-16 pistol, slapped it on his belt, and then prepared to leave. Shmi was perfectly fine with him having a weapon at this point, considering Tatooine had gotten worse over the years. She was happy with him keeping himself safe, especially since that mechanic shop he worked at seemed to care so much about him. Anakin called out and said goodbye to his mom, as he exited the home and slammed into something that jarred him back. He fell backwards and felt his face. Why was it wet? He looked up and saw a body, lightly spinning around in circles, hanging from the ledge of the door. Anakin looked at the side of the wall and saw the markings of the twin sons' gang. He got up and quickly pulled his mother down, but she was already dead. Her neck snapped under the weight of an early morning breeze. Her last thoughts and the excitement her son shared for what he could finally have with her after so many years of disappointment. Anakin ran out into the street and smelled burning. He looked back and he could see the apartment set ablaze. He thought of 3PO at the last second and ran in to save the droid, being that it was the last thing he had left before an explosion threw him to his feet. Anakin's face was covered in ash as he rubbed his eyes clean and ran into cover, pulling his blaster from his belt and looking around. Luckily for him, a sandstorm had rolled in. He could see the fires burning and he could smell it too. His mother and 3PO were gone. The thoughts replayed in his mind over and over again. His mother and 3PO gone. His mother and 3PO were gone. He hid behind a crate and took a deep breath, trying to process what just happened. He got up and ran for the crew location. As he ran, he slipped over and fell over things in the way, hardly finding his way back to the cantina. He stumbled in as Jalem asked him what happened, quickly bringing a wet cloth over to his face and wiping the blood and ash from it. Anakin stuttered out words, none of them making any sense, but one of the crew members in the corner understood. He told Jalem that the twin suns struck again. They must have aligned themselves with Watto. The reality is, Watto aligned himself with them. He mostly figured out that Skywalker joined Dragon's Breath, and he decided that he would get himself protection. Obviously, they didn't care about him. They wanted a reason to fight for power. They now had an excuse because Dragon's Breath killed a twin sun's shop owner. Anakin asked them what they did now, and Jalem turned to the crew and told them prepare for war. The crew quickly got together as messages went out to crew members across the city as they mounted up their weapons. The Twin Suns was the largest other group in the city. This battle between the two largest crews in Mos Espa. However, one would essentially be untouchable for the foreseeable future. They'd be able to bully all the other gangs in this mission if they wanted, considering there were no rules about doing that, just caps on how large a crew could get. Dragon's Breath saw this as their chance to take the throne. The same went for the Twin Suns. This was their chance to finally take a hold of Mos Espa, all for themselves. The crews were getting ready. Jalem told Anakin to stick with him. He was a good shot, but this was much different than target practice. This was all-out war. Each crew had a different location to start, and the people of the city knew it was coming. The streets very quickly emptied out as the war approached its beginning. Dragon's Breath didn't make the first move, but they drew Twin Suns out into making that move. Dragon's Breath sent a larger speeder that was covered and didn't really work out into the middle of the street, and Twin Suns bit the bait. They opened fire on the speeder and it exploded, ripping through buildings, killing civilians, and so forth. Inside of Jabba's palace, he watched a hologram layout presented in front of him. All the scum were ready, because Jabba would put out hits on different people to make the game a little bit more fun. It took the sense of control the gangs had away from them to weaken their morale. But he wouldn't do that unless the battle went on for too long. He knew that the people would get tired of their daimyo if he didn't stand up for them once in a while. Jabba could very easily wipe out both gangs if he wanted, but no one knew that. Anakin and Jalem moved in, side by side. One of the more militaristic individuals was taking the lead for Anakin in this mission, which the passing of the torch went by really easily. The main focus was winning this battle. The streets began to fill with blaster fire as the crews found each other. Dragon's Breath took an early lead, and the explosion at the beginning really helped with that, though they needed to hold that advantage. Jalem broke off for Anakin as he led a group of elite fighters down a different path. They were going to ambush the Twin Suns on the far side. Anakin was fighting behind doors and alleyways, ducking in and out and using his amazing shot to lay down covering fire. He was fighting with fire in his eyes. In his first test of battle, he rose to the moment. The killing that he was so afraid of had vanished. He was seeing nothing but red in this moment, chasing the victory that he believed he deserved. As the fighting intensified, men around him started to drop, and he was quickly becoming surrounded. Dragon's Breath had become arrogant with their stance as the most elite gang in the city, and Twin Suns were making them pay for it. Because Skywalker was ambidextrous when it came to using pistols, mostly in part to Jalem, he quickly got to work using two pistols and shooting down the opposition threats. He was locked down in a corner with the Twin Suns ganging up on him, until a rocket launched past him and crushed into a building, setting it ablaze. A number of civilians died in the blast. It was a shot that came from the Twin Suns, a misfire. He turned around and shot the rocket man as he let another pistol go and it slammed down into position right in front of him. But it wasn't close enough to do damage. Instead, it flipped the speeder on top of a Twin Suns gang member. Anakin smiled before blasting his pistols forward, seeing an advantage in front of him. He spun out from behind the cover and started forward. The few men and women who were bunkered down with him looked up in awe as he cut through his foes. They got up seeing this as their chance to retake the advantage. Anakin blasted away, sidestepping more blaster fire and avoiding rockets of the sort. A massive tank came down the alleyway, and he and the crew ducked out of the way. Skywalker turned back and saw a rocket lying on the ground. He told the crew to cover him. He lunged backwards, sliding across the sand as his crew members were blasted away by the heavy cannon. He grabbed the rocket and launched it forward. It was a perfect shot, slipping right down the barrel of the cannon and forcing the tank to explode. Inside Jabba's palace, he chuckled at the resourcefulness of the scum. He told Bib Fortuna to have someone figure out who that kid was and keep an eye on him if he survived the battle. This wasn't favoritism, it was turning a profit. If the kid was able to survive, he'd be a good bounty hunter in the future. But like all great prospects, it was a matter of time if he survived or not. In the streets of Mos Espa, the twin sons began using people as cannon fodder. Anakin and Dragon's Breath had finally gotten some control over the battlefield, but they couldn't risk pushing forward because it could cause more civilian casualties. As they were doing a fighting retreat, Dragon's Breath was under fire from another group. It was much smaller, and they were rather despised by everyone else in Mos Espa. It was a group called the Tusken's Marksmen. It was an all-boys club, and they were boys. Well, at least they acted like it. Gatekeepers and so forth. They just loved to provoke the loss of brain cells, and the worst part is, they were all terrible shots. But they wanted to throw their name in the hat. They saw the two sides fighting, and they believed they could earn favorability with the twin sons by fighting against Dragon's Breath. But it wasn't working. Both sides collectively turned their attention to their mutual foe, and fired at them. Mostly because twin sons couldn't see Dragon's Breath at the moment, and Dragon's Breath was pissed off. Just as they fought off the Tusken's Marksmen, a counter-assault came from Jalen. It was the cavalry too, the most elite gunsmen in Mos Espa, and the counter-assault worked like a charm. However, twin sons knew they would lose this battle, so they prepared. They approached the civilians that were left in the open, and they were bombed. The worst part of all of it is that Jalen recognized it before it happened, so he's able to reroute the troops at the last second. The bombs exploded, destroying wings of homes, bunkers, and medical facilities. Most of the casualties were innocent civilians who were trying to avoid the gang war. Jalen had two choices, and he chose the one that best represented him in Dragon's Breath. He went and helped the people. Anakin and his pinned-down squad saw this, so they broke out and made their way over to Jalen and the rest of the crew. They were pulling people out of the rubble as the more elite gunsmen kept an eye out on the perimeter. People were outraged, and while the gang fights were common, this was a war. While the consensus is that Dragon's Breath started the conflict, it was now understood that the true agitators were twin sons. Anakin came over and helped people out of the rubble. Some of them he carried, others he and a couple other members of the crew put into a safe location, until the firefight started again. Anakin saw a young woman about his age ducking under the rubble. She was the last one to survive the bombing. Anakin had just carried her grandmother from the wreckage of their home, and now she was in danger. He didn't want any innocent civilians to die in the firefight, and from his perspective, it was another civilian. He moved forward with the rest of the crew as they noticed their opponents were taking up higher ground. Jalen told Anakin to head up the stairs with him. Before they ascended, Anakin pulled a piece of rubble over to cover the young woman's side. He moved up, and as he got to the top, Jalen was shot in the chest. He fell backwards and landed on a spiky satellite. He cried out in agony. Anakin was in shock, but he didn't have time to react. He turned his attention forward and opened fire. Anger in his face, tears in his eyes. The Twin Sons members were cut down as they tried to fight with him. Some of them got close enough to him where they were able to engage in fist-to-fist combat. Anakin ducked and weaved. He was really good on defense, but offense was a little different. Jalen threw him his personal blade as Anakin took the weapon and spun it in his hand as he jabbed it into someone's neck before kicking them off the roof. Skywalker was kicked in the back of the head and he stumbled down, but Jalen put his hands out and caught him. Anakin thanked him before turning back and shoving the blade into a man's stomach before twisting it. He pulled his pistol from his belt and slapped it onto the man's shoulder, using him as a stand as he opened fire into some of the other crew members that began to retreat. Skywalker threw the body down and ran over to Jalen's side and asked if he was alright, trying to help him up. The rest of Dragon's Breath began rushing forward to finish off the Twin Sons. Jalen took Anakin's hand and told him firmly, using all of his strength to say every word he needed Anakin to hear.
I love you, kid. You know I do. This place, it's not for you. Get off this rock. Go live a life you deserve to live. I'll always be proud of you.
Anakin held Jalen's hand until it went limp and he fell back onto his deathly still body. Anakin shook his head. This couldn't be real. He couldn't lose two people in the same day. As he was standing there, he got communications from one of the other crew members.
Anakin, we got him on the run. Come join us.
An explosion ripped through the air as the audio cut out. Skywalker turned over and his heart sank into his stomach. That was the last of Dragon's Breath. All the remaining members had just gone over to fight off the rest of the Twin Sons, but it was evident they wanted to exterminate the entire crew. There was no playing around. After decades upon decades of finally losing, they figured out how to break past the crew. Anakin was the last member left. They'd be coming for him. He looked back down at Jalen's dead body and listened to the words over and over again inside of his head. He couldn't let Mos Espa suffer. So before he got off this rock, he needed to do some work. He looked down the street. The smoke plumes still high in the sky. He could hear members of the Twin Sons gang cheering. They were loud people as it was, and he could hear them talking about finding him and gutting him in the city square. They were going to torture him for being the last one of them alive. It was their whole plan, which is why their final bomb was deployed. Anakin had to admit, the resourcefulness in such little time was very impressive. They got us all set up before morning and after learning of Watto's death in the early evening the previous night. Anakin patted Jalen's body and slid down the side of the burned up building. He grabbed his pistols and looked at them. He knew that this was his final stand. Still holding the K-16 Briar pistol that Jalen gave him when he first joined, he took a deep breath and looked down the street, and could see about 30 Twin Sons members hustling down the streets. Anakin slid down and leaned his head back and closed his eyes. He was 15, How in the Dune Sea was he supposed to do this? He was sitting there. He heard a psst psst come from the right side. He turned his head over and saw the girl he saved. She waved him over and he shook his head and pointed over his shoulder. She pointed down the alleyway and held up a pistol. Anakin thought this would be interesting, so he got up and scurried across the street and followed her into the alleyway. She pulled him around the corner.
First, I want to say thank you for saving my grandmother. Second, we can beat these guys. You just need to trust me.
Why get involved in the gang warfare? You don't need to risk your life.
Well, not for nothing. Your gang is kinda gone. And their gang will also be gone. Plus, if you target my grandmom, it's personal.
Fair point. My name's Anakin.
Shh, no time for that. Look over here. We need to split up down this alleyway. Every 2 crevices, there's an opening. Use that hole to jump down, move back, jump up, and fire. Understood?
Wait. Yes? I think?
She shoved Anakin down the alley as he was trying to figure out what she meant. The young woman pushed Anakin down one of the crevices and pointed at a small latch. It clicked in an instant. What was this, and how did she know about it? He didn't have time. The young woman ran back a little further and hid in one of the crevices. She used a couple stacked crates and boxes and climbed up to see if she could see anyone coming from higher ground. They were clear at the moment. She then heard them coming around the corner at the surface level. A smile formed across her face as she slid back down and kept her head peeled back. She'd wait until the guy started firing. Anakin used a mirror he had in his pocket to see over those who were entering the alleyway. He had it on his person at all times, just to keep a cool-looking hairstyle for the crew. He could see the twin suns move in, their ugly badge shining in the sunlight. Anakin waited until they were a couple meters away from him as he peeled around the corner, lifting his pistols and firing away. Chaos caught them off guard, a couple of them being killed by their own men as they started to charge in at Anakin, and he opened up a latch and jumped down. At the same time, the young woman opened fire, which completely blindsided the men of the twin suns. She clapped a couple kills before a heavy gunner made his way down the alleyway with a rotator cannon. The woman dropped down into a hole and met up with Skywalker down there. She told him to move, and he did. The two of them popped up in 2 different crevices after she told him about the heavy gunner. When the two of them got to the surface level again, they both found a means to climb up to the roofs, and so they did. Anakin was on the right side of the alleyway, and the woman was on the other side. As they got to the top, they looked over, confirming seeing each other. This wasn't planned, it was completely coincidental, but they smiled at each other with confidence. The thugs made their way into the alleyway below them, looking for the 2 attackers. Anakin kicked the box down as it crushed the heavy gunner in the head. His pistols opened fire as the young woman ran past him towards the street. A few of the remaining members were making their way up to the top level as she ran forward full speed, kicking one of them in the throat as he toppled backwards before pulling her pistol and firing into the faces as they tried to ascend. Anakin cut down the few remaining members inside the alleyway before getting over to the building adjacent to the young woman. She pointed down the street. It was the last member. Even worse, it was the leader of the twin suns. He survived the onslaught and still had the courage to try and run away. Anakin pulled his pistol out and aimed it, and fired it to precision. The blaster bolt slid through the air and clipped the man right in the back, killing him instantly. When Anakin turned around, he noticed the woman was gone. That was weird. He made his way over to the street level and got down, asking if the people were alright. Most of them were. A lot of them were injured, but alive was certainly alright in their books. After that battle had taken place, they were more than just happy to be breathing. Anakin then remembered the bomb that went off earlier, before the twin suns came looking for him, so he ran forward to check it out. By the time he got over there, he just looked into a sea of dead bodies. It had taken so long. Most of them bled to death or were simply killed in the explosion. The colors of dragon's breath littered the street. Anakin slid to his knees and took it all in. He felt so terrible what had happened. He knew he technically couldn't blame himself, but he wanted to. It felt like the natural thing to do. Sand filled around his knees, and he felt the heat beating down on him. The battle lasted past high noon, and the middle of the day was excruciating. Anakin grabbed the hot sands from the ground and balled it up in his fists. He thought about Jalen's final words to him and took them in. As a 15-year-old, it was hard to grasp what the trauma had just done to him and what he'd been through. If anything, it felt like the terrible dream, and he would wake up tomorrow with his mother and Jalen and Dragon's Breath and everything would be alright. But that tomorrow didn't exist anymore. The 2 biggest and longest standing gangs were completely destroyed. Anakin had no place belonging in the Dragon's Breath anymore, because like his friend said, he needed to get off this planet. While he was taking in the sight, the young woman who helped him survive the battle came up and asked him if he was alright. He turned over to her and nodded his head quietly. She just told him that she wanted to thank him for saving her grandmother. She understood that in the moment he didn't want to hear it, but if they never saw each other again, she wanted to make sure he knew that his efforts would be treasured for a lifetime. Anakin looked up at her, her face covered in a silhouette as she stood in front of the twin suns of Tatooine.
What's your name? And how did you know all about that stuff?
I'm Xana Pax. And you know, girls gotta eat. I'm a spice runner. Anything that's necessary for survival. You're Anakin, right?
Yeah, That's me. I just want to.
No need to thank me, Anakin. That was my thanks to you. You want some help up?
He nodded his head and reached out his arm as she pulled him up. The two of them turned towards the destruction. Zena made a witty but kinda sick joke about how Mos Espa couldn't get any worse. Anakin just laughed a little and twisted his head towards her. She shrugged her shoulders. Comedy was a good way to deal with trauma for her. The two of them started the discussion as the people started to fill the streets again to see the end of the conflict. But not just that, the two largest gangs in Mos Espa. Zena and Anakin started to head back towards where her grandmother was as he asked her about being a spice runner. She didn't have much to say about it other than the fact that she was able to do it because it paid for her grandmother's health issues. As they got back, Anakin learned a little bit, but not much. All he got was the fact that Zena's parents had died before she was 5 years old. Before they could continue going any further, Zena asked her grandmother how she was feeling, and she was doing alright. She just wanted to head back to bed. Zena turned over and looked at the apartment and suggested that probably wouldn't be the best place to sleep at, because it was an open bedroom. Anakin suggested that they use the Dragon Breath complex. It was a little ways away. It would be a little bit gross considering it was a group living quarters, but it would be fine. Plus, Jabba and his men probably wouldn't burn it down until the end of the week, after it was confirmed that both gangs had been destroyed. It was a way for the city to move on collectively. If a gang destroyed another gang, that either captured it or burned it to the ground. If both gangs were destroyed and survived, by no heirs to the throne, as it were, then all their facilities would be burned. This would give time for survivors to grab their things before the end of the week was up, though it would likely put a target on their head, especially if they were rude to other gang members, which was never going to be an issue with Skywalker. We never really interacted with members of other gangs up until today, so hopefully the few survivors of the Tusken's marksmen didn't remember his face. The trio walked over to the area and they had a long conversation. Zena's grandma, who just went by Grandma Pax, told Anakin that back in the day, she was once a spice runner, one of the best in the galaxy. Might explain some of her lung issues, but that's alright. She had the time of her life for the 45 years she did it. One of the best runners during the end of the Nile Reign in the Outer Rim. She had tons of stories, but not for nothing. The day had left her elated and she was ready for some rest, which she was able to get, along with some of the medical supplies she needed, thanks to what was already inside the facility. When they put Grandma Pax to bed, Anakin and Zena walked up to the roof of the building. It was still daytime, but the evening was approaching quickly, and it gave the two new allies time to talk with each other alone. Anakin and Zena very quickly understood they were actually the same age, which was kind of funny because both of them thought that the other was older by a couple years. Anakin knew being a spice runner wasn't easy, so he assumed Zena had to be 18 or 19, but no, she was just really good at it thanks to some tips and tricks her grandmother taught her. Zena thought Anakin was older thanks to his Lieutenant Patch from Dragon's Breath, but they were really just both the same age, which made everything a little funny to them, though Zena was older by only a couple of months, considering Anakin just turned 15, but that didn't really matter. As the Tatooine suns began to set, their conversation only continued to build up. They told each other about their lives, and Anakin got to learn about his newest ally and how she ended up in the place she was. As she told him, she was born in the city over in Mos Eisley. She honestly didn't remember much about her parents. All she knew is that her mother had the most beautiful blue eyes and her father had the finest hair she had ever seen. And the Outer Rim having fine hair was a great treasure, and to be complimented on it was an even greater one. Zena told Anakin that her family wasn't killed by the gang war. Rather, it was something much more horrific. A group of Tusken raiders got a bit tested with the spaceports existing and they attacked the outer layer of the city. Because the attack was so surprising, most people fled. There was a battle or a siege that took a number of days. Zena's father was a part of a group of defenders, mostly just people who operated outside the gang life and acted as middlemen to make sure civilians didn't get hurt in gang-related activities. He died during the first day of the siege, and on the 5th day, before the Tuskens were driven out, they set fire to the side of the city they broke into. Being that they were so used to the extreme weather on the planet, they perfectly predicted a sandstorm, so the fire spread with intensity, and since Tatooine consistently had low water supplies, a quarter of the city was burned to the ground. In the confusion, their home caught on fire, and as they escaped, her mother was trampled to death by people running in confusion. She wasn't the only person to suffer such a fate that night, but it was the last time Zena saw either of her parents. Anakin asked her how she ended up out here in Mos Espa. She said that she snuck onto a civilian transport. She was brought out here. While Zena was still very young, Tatooine was kill or be killed. She knew where her grandmother lived, so she just needed to find her and where it was, being that it had been so long since she visited her. Luckily for Zena, her grandmother was about to come to Mos Eisley after her child hadn't responded to her a number of days. To find Zena and learn that her parents died was heartbreaking. She felt terrible, but she decided that in that moment she would raise Zena. Zena was her grandmother's pride and joy. She taught everything she learned over her vast career to Zena, and she took all those skills in stride as she became a spice runner. Anakin asked her about the spice runner life, as if he was interested in partaking in it. She expressed that he probably wouldn't care for it. In all honesty, it was tons of moving around, doing missions, and sneaking past people who could gut you with a glare. Anakin kind of liked the sound of those new adventures. Zena leaned back and smiled, telling Anakin that he'd probably make a better bounty hunter. He asked her why she thought so, and she told him that he had the grit for it. She never liked the idea of hunting people down. She was basing her assumption off the Skywalker's killing spree during the day. Someone like him would be able to make a good use of his skill in the bounty hunting game. Anakin laid back and looked at the stars. He never really wanted to be a bounty hunter, but the path ahead of him seemed to be leading towards that life, so he told her that he would think about it. Anakin, despite not knowing what he wanted to do with his life, asked Zena what she wanted. She shrugged her shoulders, admitting she never really had time for what she wanted. There was always taking care of her grandmother for her. She stopped and expressed that she didn't mind either. She definitely wasn't complaining. More or less, she just was stating that she never had aspirations of her own. Maybe she would have some in her future, but her main concern was taking care of her grandmother. Anakin kind of nudged her forward and tried to see if there's anything she really wanted. She turned to him and looked up at the sky and said that she wanted to get off this dust bowl. She wanted to be happy and she wanted to have peace. She expressed her hopefulness for a gig to go right so she could get her big break. You know, the spice run of all spice runs. One where she'd be able to bring home more than enough credits than anyone could imagine. She could buy a Star Cruiser and make it a gambling cruise, and then she could live on it and make continuous profit while running around the core. It sounded like a fun idea. She then joked about how fun it would be to be the daimyo of Tatooine, someone who could have real change for the people or whatever. Anakin giggled at the joke and then thanked her for her kindness. She asked what he meant, and he stayed silent for a moment before telling her that he lost his mother and his best friend today. Though not for nothing, his best friend was kind of like a father figure to him. Anakin had mentioned all of it to her, even the situation regarding not having a father, but he kind of avoided going back to the topic of those people dying. She could only assume, but she didn't want to say anything until he said something. Zena sat up and asked him if he was alright. He mirrored her by sitting up too and shrugging his shoulders. He said he hadn't really processed it yet. That was the difficult thing. Once he processed it, it would probably be a lot more difficult. The two of them sat in silence for a couple of minutes before falling asleep on the roof of the building. They were woken by a banging at the door in the early morning. Anakin sauntered down quickly as he opened the door for a man of Jabba's palace who asked him if he was Anakin Skywalker. He nodded his head. The man asked if he'd be able to accompany them to speak with Jabba the Hutt. Anakin rubbed his eyes and asked what that was about, and Bib told the young man that Jabba saw potential during yesterday's standoff. He would like a chance to speak to him about a job opportunity in the near future. Anakin nodded his head while covering up a yawn. He didn't really process what was said to him, so as he entered the room again, he walked up to the top where he and Zena had fallen asleep, and she asked him if he was going. He looked over at her with a confused look on his face. She pointed to the edge of the roof. He looked over, and then it clicked. She could hear the conversation from the top side. Anakin shrugged and sat back down. He told her that he'd go check it out. She smiled and urged him to do it. Something that surprised Anakin was Zena's seemingly selfless personality. She just wanted to help people, which was a rarity on Tatooine. Despite Jalem's kindness to Anakin, he had other motives. He needed people for his crew, and Anakin was cheap and easy labor. Zena wanted Anakin to genuinely succeed, and he was appreciative for that. One thing that stood out even more than that was the fact that she didn't seem at all jealous about the chance for Anakin to get a job that would give him more than she currently had. Zena had been trying to get a job with Jabba for years. The only thing she could manage was local gigs. But being that Anakin picked up on this, he would make a mention to it of Jabba upon his arrival. At least at the moment, while he was confident, it didn't seem like that big of a deal. But standing in front of the crime lord himself was much different. Telling Jabba to his face would be a lot more tantalizing. Anakin got himself ready and told Zena that he would come back and speak with her if he could. She just laughed it off and told him to go. When Anakin arrived at Jabba's palace, all of his confidence had seemingly disappeared. He understood a little bit of Huttese, but he was rusty with it. Bib Fortuna brought him back into the Master's throne room, and Anakin stood before a bunch of the galaxy's most renowned bounty hunters, smugglers, and spice runners. It was a bit much to take in, but he was ready to accept whatever Jabba wanted to say.
Almighty Jabba, I'm grateful that your excellence sees my potential. What services are you requesting of me? Well, you named two of my greatest attributes, Jabba, but I'd like to help out a friend.
Skywalker could feel the wandering eyes in the room lock onto him. He felt really stupid sticking his neck out for Zena like that, but then he saw the pay stub for the mission and what his mission was, which was literally nothing. Collect a scavenger from the Ryloth system. Then he saw the requirements. If he was brought in alive, that'd be more credits. If not, no biggie, just less pay. Anakin couldn't believe his eyes. Luckily, he had the credits to get a ship and buy some supplies for himself. Bib walked up to him, handed him the tracking fob, and showed him a hologram of the man he was meant to be hunting. Didn't look too difficult. Anakin bowed before Jabba and left the palace in a rush. When he got back to Mos Espa, he found Zena again and asked how she was doing. She was fine, nothing much was happening. She just found out that the ring of spice runners she worked with had been discovered by a rising gang and had been taken out, but she couldn't really complain. The most recent battle kind of saved her life. If the battle didn't happen, she likely would have died in the conflict that cracked open her spice runners guild. Anakin was apologetic for her loss, but she was alright, no need to dwell on it. Plus, she was excited for Anakin's new journey. He didn't say anything to her about what he said to Jabba. He'd rather just keep that a secret. If she betrayed him, then he would at least know that it wasn't worth his time. It'd also be a good gauge to see if she was willing to keep herself around as a loyal friend than just to gain something from him. He asked her what she would do now. She was optimistic. Because of her grandmother, she knew where all the prominent spice runners guilds were, so she would probably just go out and investigate them first. He was happy to hear. She wished him luck on his journey and said that maybe they'd see each other around. Anakin kinda nodded his head and walked off. He stopped and turned back to ask if she would like to help him pick out a ship, but she was gone. That was odd. Though Anakin noted that she was always like a ghost. Zena Pax could just disappear under the suns and reappear when she wanted. It was who she was. It's what he learned about her the previous night. Being a spice runner really aided her in that particular way. Anakin kept turning back every couple feet to see if she would just magically reappear, but she didn't. How odd. When Anakin got to a starship yard, he was given the basic rundown of prices and so forth, so Anakin had to walk towards the back of the lot, because all the cheaper vessels were back there. But he saw something that caught his eye. It was a Corellian-engineered ship. Not just any ship, but a fine bounty hunting ship. It was a YV-666 light freighter, and it had a rusty paint job. Bathing in the sun every day certainly didn't help, but it was in Anakin's range. When he went inside the vessel, he could see that it actually was really well maintained. It was just at the back of the lot and had been there for a very long time, simply because of bad paint job. A great representation of judging a ship from its cover. Everything else was fine in the ship. Anakin bought the vessel and quickly got himself all the extra supplies he needed before filling up the YV and preparing to depart. He didn't really want to waste time with his mission. Anakin got himself in the hyperspace and moved into the middle of the ship to investigate everything he didn't review while he was in the shop. Anakin found secret hatches, his bed, and a couple of other things. He started looking around and began envisioning what he would do with the interior. He thought of a holotable in the corner, a rack of gear and weapons, maybe a trophy case for his best captures or whatnot. He was excited looking at it all. Maybe it wasn't what he originally wanted to do, but as a bounty hunter, he could take advantage of what initially seemed like a bad situation. He was content with the situation at the moment. He looked at his gear and started siphoning through it. He had a couple of bombs and grenades that he got from the local arms dealer. It was someone he and the crew went to all the time. Because Anakin was a part of the former crew, he got a good deal. He let out the supplies he would probably use on Ryloth. First was a K-16 pistol, which had a stun mode on it. Another thing was probably the cufflinks. Obviously, there was so much he needed to learn about the art of bounty hunting, but this was at the very least a start. For his first trip through hyperspace, or even his first time in space, he didn't know how to feel. Part of him was excited, part of him was nervous. The rest of him was kind of monotone about it. He sat in the bay by himself, lying down on his bed, and looking up at the ceiling. After this mission, maybe he'd get a partner or a droid to go along with him. It would at least give him some company in the ship. Not for nothing, the silence of the ship rattling through hyperspace gave him time to think about the loss of Shmi and Jalen. He didn't really have time to get through it, or think about it, let alone process it. So much happened so quickly, and now he was alone for the first time in his life. He always had the support in the background. While Zena was kind, there wasn't a guarantee that she would stick around. Anakin thought about the idea of her. The idea was nice. Maybe he was thinking about it too much, but at the moment, it'd be choice to have her next to him. It was a bit of idealistic visioning, but at the very least, it was comforting to think about. He found a small hologram device and opened it. How interesting. It was a ship log, and the previous owner put a bunch of holo recordings on it. When Anakin opened it up, it was a female Twi'lek. She never said her name, she just talked about her journeys inside the ship of what she called Nighthawk. Anakin did not like the name, so he decided he'd call it something else. But he listened for hours until he arrived inside of Ryloth. It was like a show. He was hooked the second he started listening into it. It gave him insights into her life and how it was being a bounty hunter for her. Though she never said anything about what her name was, it was all hidden. Probably intentionally, but Anakin had a lot more time to go through it when he finished the mission. He made his way down and pulled the ship down into the capital city of the planet. As he exited the ship, he looked at the hologram and then looked around the city streets. He realized this would be much more difficult. The Twi'leks all looked pretty much the same to him. At least that interpretation was based on the crude image on the hologram, so it'd be much harder for him to find the guy.
Wouldn't it be better if a leather holster could lock? With limited carry options, responsible gun owners know.
Anakin stepped out of the ship, his boots clacking against the surface of the ground as he began walking into the city streets. Skywalker looked at his fob and saw it begin to blink. He walked forward patiently. He knew, or at least assumed, that he shouldn't be holding his fob outside of him, so he placed it into his jacket pocket. The fob vibrated, and he could feel it vibrating against his chest as he moved through the streets. There were people from around the galaxy here in the markets and walking around. Skywalker kept his eyes peeled as he ducked into one of the markets to fit in. He picked up a couple fruits and stuff, looking around at everything. The shop owners talked to him, but he barely engaged with them. He just moved around, taking everything in sight. The fob began to vibrate more and more. He turned his head back and saw a man covering his head and walking through the street. Anakin pulled the fob out and saw the man's name. He turned back and called the man's name out quietly. The man stopped and looked around trying to find who it was that said his name, before turning back and running. Anakin slid between two people and then put his hand on someone's shoulder to give him enough momentum to jump over a kid instead of running them over. The man he was chasing slipped but caught himself. Anakin sped up. The Twi'lek began to run through the crowd as Skywalker put his hand on his belt, but sped forward knowing he couldn't pull the weapon in a crowd of people. The man continued to evade Skywalker until he was tripped by a stand. He caught his foot on the edge of the stand and Anakin booked it around the corner, pulling his pistol and shooting a stun round into the Twi'lek's head, and it knocked him out completely. Anakin walked over and wrapped his wrists up in the cufflinks. He turned around and looked at the people walking by. It was the Outer Rim. No one cared. The guy was caught, and the bounty hunter could kill him if he wanted to. Anakin reached down and lifted the man up over his shoulders and carried him back to the starship. Eventually, when he returned, he threw the man down onto the ground. He could see the pipe that was stuck onto the wall, and so he unshackled one of the wrists and put the cufflinks around the pipe and then tightened them up. The man was still unconscious and he wouldn't wake up until they were in hyperspace. Anakin went to the cockpit and lifted the ship out of the atmosphere and jumped to hyperspace. When it was done, he came back down and listened to more recordings done by the Twi'lek who owned the ship before him. As he was listening to her, he pulled the patch off his jacket and stuck it to the wall. He knew what he would call this old rust bucket. The name Dragon's Eye sounded cool to him. It'd be a nice way to remember his crew, but also make it more of his own thing. Plus, he thought the name Eye was a bit cooler than Breath. Maybe that was just him, but it sounded better. The captured man tried to bribe his way out of the situation, but he wouldn't get that lecture as Anakin just ignored him until they flew down to Jabba's palace. He was allowed to park in the hangar bay after scratching the roof of his ship on the interior of the bay. When Anakin walked out, Bib Fortuna told him to work on his piloting skills, which was something Anakin said he would do. He was apologetic for the little incident, but he was forgiven, no biggie. No one got hurt. The prisoner was taken away by some of Jabba's guards. Anakin, on the other hand, was brought back to Jabba's throne room, where he was waiting eagerly. When Anakin arrived, there was a bit of a party. Bib whispered into Anakin's ear and told him to take a seat and enjoy some refreshments with the other scum. Anakin nodded his head and walked over. He was a bit nervous about the potential cliques around this area, but that wasn't an issue. Most of the bounty hunters got along with each other, just out of mutual respect. If someone didn't respect you, you knew. Most bounty hunters saw Anakin as a new kid on the block. One of them waved him over and sat him down at their table. They talked to him for a little bit, getting an idea of the mindset behind him and what he wanted from his line of work. Anakin just shrugged. He was excited, but he just didn't know what to expect. For the bounty hunters, there was sort of this honor among thieves mindset, which gave them the confidence to tell Skywalker some tips and tricks. Of course, each bounty hunter kept their best secrets and tricks to themselves. But the basic stuff? Sure, no issue. After they asked a series of questions and got some tips and tricks to each other, Anakin asked about the singer. One of the bounty hunters leaned over and said her name was LDR. She just caught a big break and she was making her way to Coruscant to be a performer at large venues. Jabba wanted to have her around before she got out that far into the galaxy. It was like a goodbye celebration. She'd been with Jabba for the longest time, and finally after so many years of hard work, she was getting her chance out in the Corps. Anakin enjoyed the show and continued talking with the other bounty hunters. They gave some tips and tricks about who to work for. While a bounty hunter could work with each other and other syndicate groups, it was probably best for Anakin to avoid working with the Pikes or the Zygerians. They were the worst to work for him, but the Pikes have been getting better as of late. Anakin didn't realize it, but he wouldn't have those same luxuries. Many of the other bounty hunters didn't know it either. At the moment, they assumed Anakin was someone from off-world, but since he was Tatooine born, he'd be a contract bounty hunter, which for Jabba meant that Anakin could only get jobs from Jabba himself or the Hutt cartel, which would either be on Nal Hutta, on Coruscant with Zero the Hutt, or on Tatooine. Anakin didn't know this until he approached the almighty Jabba the Hutt after LDR finished her performance with Jabba. Though she did promise him that she would come back and perform a high production show for him once a year or once every couple years to thank him for all he did to get her to where she was now. Skywalker then got to stand before Jabba, and he waited to hear what the crime lord thought.
Thank you, Almighty Jabba, for your hospitality and belief. My friend is a spice runner, and a damn good one at that. I think she'd make a good member of your crew. Thank you, Jabba. Also, I'm ready for your next hit. Whatever it is, I'll take care of it as fast as I can.
Jabba pointed to Bib Fortuna, who walked forward and brought with him the first true challenge for Skywalker. Just like any bounty hunter under contract with the Hutts, Anakin had an easy first mission to complete. If his ego got high, then chances are he would die in the following bounty. If the individual were able to remain calm and collected, then the following bounty would have no issues for them. Anakin took the fob and the Hutt cartel pendant with him and thanked Fortuna, before making his way back down to the hangar and leaving the palace. Instead of going out to the galaxy to finish the mission, he decided that he'd go back to Mos Espa and tell Zena about the potential opportunity. He landed in one of the many landing zones and even paid someone to repaint his ship so it looked newer. It also seemed like he was here for a reason. The best part is he was still doing this with credits he earned while he was still with the crew. The credits he just got from Jabba he could save for a while. Anakin walked through the streets for what felt like hours, and then he eventually found her. She was outside of a new apartment complex trying to do something. He startled her, which elicited a firm punch to the shoulder. She asked what he was doing back and he shrugged his shoulders. He just said he was here to tell her that if she wanted, he got her a chance to work for Jabba. Zena looked back at him with confusion on her face, and she asked him what he meant. Anakin handed her the Hutt cartel pendant, and told her that sure she paid him back and whatnot, but he was going to be completely honest. He felt like he owed her for helping him in that skirmish. She asked if he was sure about this and he nodded his head. She gently took it from his hand and told him that she was very appreciative. She didn't know how to thank him for such an opportunity. He shook his head, telling her that there was no need for thanks. The two of them stood silently staring at each other for a moment before Anakin asked her what she was doing over here. She shrugged her shoulders. She was looking for a new place to call home. She was hoping that she could use some of her inside knowledge to blackmail the owner to let her and her grandmother stay here, but she wasn't sure if this was the right place or not. Anakin asked her where her grandmother was, and she said that she was currently inside of the ship. It was technically Zena's, but her grandmother was the one who bought it and used it for spice running for all 45 years that she did it. Anakin nodded his head, and then he remembered that when she was done, or if she had the time, he just bought a new starship, and her talking about it reminded him. She told him that she would love to see it, but maybe later. Anakin just smiled, and he told her that he could show her when he got back. She asked where he was going, and he smiled, putting his hands on his hips, telling her that he was just going to become one of the most ruthless bounty hunters in the Outer Rim. Zena chuckled and nudged at him, suggesting that with pearly whites like his, he wasn't going to scare anyone. Anakin rolled his eyes at the notion, but it was all in good fun. He also handed her his communication frequency and told her that she should contact him whenever she wanted. She took it and looked at him with a raised eyebrow, and told him to get going with a glimmer in her smile. She turned back around and giggled to herself. This was a place. This was the guy she had dirt on. She could blackmail her way in. No one wants to bring their grandmother with them while they're being a spice runner. She turned back to see Anakin walk through the crowd. Anakin could feel her eyes on him, and when he turned back to see her, she was gone again. Gone like a ghost. Like a whisper. Too sweet to hold on to and too quiet to last forever. He twisted his head a little before turning back and going to his YZ-666 light freighter. He got in and looked at the fob. It was a trip to Florum. This wouldn't be fun. He was targeting a pirate inside of a pirate base run by Hondo Anaka.
And that's gonna end part 2. Lot longer than that part 1, but this is part 2. Again, channel part 2. Channel will be in the description below again, like always. Goodbye for now, and then tomorrow or next time I might do part 3. Alright? Remember to subscribe, like, and share. And let's see if we get to 5k. 5k or no, 1.5k subscribers. Let's start slow. Anyway, bye for now, and I'll see you next time.